Please go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Jay. I'm fighting a bit of a cold, so I have a bottle of water here, and let's dig right into it. So, I want to first talk about the foundations of what we need to look at. And again, my lens really comes from a governmental municipal lens of emergency management, and everything that I'm talking about here probably works in other systems for NGOs, for private business, but you might have to tweak some of it. And of course, I don't pretend to be an expert in all aspects of emergency management, but I wanted to really talk about that evacuation and recovery aspect. And we start that from a foundation of the legislation and powers on evacuation. So in every municipality and every region of Canada, you will have an authority with holds the jurisdiction for you to be able to do such things as actually move humans. Humans have rights, and you can't just tell them to leave or go somewhere else unless they're threatened or they're at risk. And generally, there's a set of guidelines, legislation, and powers on evacuation. For us, it's our City Winnipeg Charter. It is also our emergency plan and legislation that comes from the province of Manitoba. It is absolutely imperative that when you're working with your stakeholders, that everybody understands what their legislative roles are. One of the first questions that comes up in a large disaster is, can we do this? And quite often, the next question is, somebody better contact the lawyers. And where that comes from is the reality that we're not always clear on the interpretation of the powers that we actually have, either under a state or local emergency at a local level or at a provincial level of the emergency. So understanding those legislative powers on evacuations and when do you do them and how do you do them is very important. We can dig into this aspect all hour, but I want to just tell you that's the foundation concepts. And I want to get into a little bit of the political issues and some of the ownerships of an evacuation. So once you have your legislative authority or your power structure set up about who's going to give you the authority to make a decision to evacuate, now you have to actually understand that you've just opened up a can of worms. Every disaster in Canada that's ever happened affects people and starts at the local level and then moves up, possibly affecting hundreds, could be just dozens, thousands, or millions of individuals. Now, at the end of a disaster, it always ends back down at the local level again. So we like to say in municipal emergency management that all disasters start local and end local. But what that means is also all disasters become political. And in an evacuation, these are also political. And the reason why is because somebody has to own the evacuation. When you evacuate a population, not only are you taking care of the people that you've evacuated, but you're taking care of their possessions. You're taking care of their property, and you're taking care of their well-being for as long as that disaster is unstable. And even when it stabilizes, you still have accountability at some level until we can actually get people back and recovered, hopefully into a state that existed before the disaster. And as we know, we talk about being ready for 72 hours. We talk about being ready and being self-fulfilled with your own emergency kits. We know now through the federal government, through the provincial governments, through indigenous governments, that 72 hours is no longer an effective communication tool and saying that's how long you have to be self-sufficient for in an evacuation to take care of yourself. We know this because of the disasters and the history of what's happened across our country. In Manitoba alone, our wildfire season was horrific. There was really no situation where 72 hours made it where we could take care of everybody. And we have a lot of history in Alberta, in British Columbia, and in Ontario, and all across this country where 72 hours just doesn't cut it anymore. So the politics of owning a disaster and owning an evacuation means someone has to be accountable. And what does that mean? Who's going to pay? And unfortunately, that's a question that comes up all the time in evacuations. If we evacuate people, who takes care of them? Strong leaders make decisions to take care of the wellness of the people first and then worry about the costing. Now, that's not to say that the costing isn't going to be one of the telltale determinants on how we take care of it. But if you've ever wondered the decision on if we put people in hotels or congregate sheltering and where those decisions come from, part of that equation is cost. So the politics of a disaster and the ownership and evacuation is important. Who had the power to make the call? What were the hazards and the risks? And how did we determine that this group of people, 5 people or 5,000 people, needed to move? And whoever is the authority having jurisdiction now owns the responsibility of the authority and the accountability of taking care of those individuals. For what we're saying now is quite possibly could be more than 72 hours. It could be days, weeks, and in some cases in this country, we've seen evacuations that are lasting months. And that creates a whole other aspect involving taking care of individuals and their mental health, their psychosocial health, their physical health, their spiritual health. It is a change in dynamic that we are seeing in evacuations. So the political issues in terms of ownership are something that we always have to be aware of. I want to move into evacuation tactics and pre-planning. Every department you have to sorry, not every department, every jurisdiction and every group needs to be able to do their hazard, risk, and vulnerability assessments to understand where in your municipality or your region you may have a threat that may require an evacuation. So recently, there was a code change in the city of Winnipeg, which allowed different commercial entities to change their business operations. So one company went from making ABC to 123. And that switch meant that the 123 that they were now going to manufacture had a much higher risk and hazard notification on our scale. That means I have to change our plans on what would happen if something bad would happen at that factory, and we would have to evacuate people due to a fire, an explosion, or some sort of chemical release. What that means to me is I have to now have a better understanding of my evacuation tactics for that specific hazard in that area. And that may mean working with a multitude of stakeholders. In my jurisdiction, the police service is responsible for the authority of the actual eviction and evacuation of people. You have to be a peace officer in the province of Manitoba for me to actually go knock on your door. And I'm going to pick on Sasha right now because I see her face and she's right beside me on my screen. So, Sasha, if I showed up at your house in the province of Manitoba and I told that you only had 10 minutes to evacuate, I would have to do that under the authority and jurisdiction of the powers that we have of our local municipality. But in Manitoba, I would also need a peace officer there to be able to issue that order for you to evacuate. And the reality is, we go back to the politics. You may choose to ignore us at your own peril, and you may choose to not understand the risks. Very rarely do we get in a situation where a peace officer or an evacuation tactical team will forcefully remove someone from their home. The reason why is politics, image. The reality of the situation is that people have free will, and we want people to be able to make the best decisions that they can. In certain circumstances, let's say if Sasha had other relatives that were vulnerable or children, or maybe, someone there that couldn't take care of themselves, in that situation, maybe we would negotiate with Sasha to take those people away. And if Sasha wanted to stay back behind at her own peril, then that would be something that might have to be left to her own accord. So the tactics of evacuations is very important for you to understand how you're going to do it. 2 years ago, engineers came to me and said, we have an apartment building in the west side of Winnipeg that we believe is going to fall down, and it could fall down at any moment. And there's over 350 people that live in this building. And I said to the engineers, how clear are you on when and if this building is going to fall down? And the engineers told me they don't know, but it's very probable. And they tried to tell me a whole bunch of scientific mathematical formulas on the pressures of columns and beams and the problems that were happening. And I had to stop because of the evacuation tactics. One of the things we need to talk about is strong communication. And I had to ask these engineers, would you allow your family to sleep in this apartment building tonight? And the engineer said, sir, chief, there is no way I would allow my family to sleep in this building tonight. And I said, you've just answered my question about when I need to evacuate this building. And that night, under the jurisdiction of a state or local emergency and using the police powers that we have, we removed 300 people from their apartment building, opened up a reception center, and successfully mitigated the situation. It was found within weeks after, as they started to do the mitigation and work, that that building probably would have shifted within hours or days and potentially would have collapsed on itself, similar to what happened in Florida, where almost 100 lives were lost. Evacuations can happen in a split of an eye, or based on the tactics, they could happen based off of the frequency and the need to evacuate off of the hazard and the risk. And I'll give you another example. In northern Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia, we have areas that have poor road access, and in some cases, only air access. So when you're looking at a wildfire evacuation, sometimes you have to look at it from how long is the runway that we have, what's the capacity of the airplane, and how far away is the fire that's threatening our community. There may be no smoke in your community. There may be no fire in your community, but the need to evacuate tactically may require you to evacuate 4 or 5 days out. And the reason why is because to get 1,500 or 2,000 people out of your community, when you only have a runway that allows an airplane with 16 people to be on at a time, that evacuation may take multiple days. So the tactics and planning of an evacuation require you to critically think and look at the logistics of how you're going to manage the evacuation. Are you going to do it by road? And how are you going to do it? In some situations now, we're using technology more and more. In Manitoba, just before this presentation on my cell phone, we had our biannual emergency alert test. So 1:55 today in the province of Manitoba, pretty much every cell phone got a provincial emergency alert test. That system of technology, which allows both municipal, provincial, and federal emergency managers to be able to coordinate and communicate the threats to our people. Now, this system is not perfect yet. And we do know that there has been a lot of case history, especially on the East Coast, with some pretty horrific case files where evacuation tactics and notifications may not have been done as good as they could have. And we're learning from these processes. But the systems and technology that work for you always need to be evaluated. Having a bullhorn or siren in your community may not work anymore. You may need to have door knockers. You may need to have apps. It may be a combination of boots on the ground and technology to properly evacuate and provide communication and warnings to your people. So it is critically important that the systems and technology of communication are blended with your evacuation tactics and pre-planning based on the hazard. So the first thing that we do is we understand our powers, the legislation and powers on our evacuation. The next thing that we do, we understand the power dynamics and the political elements and the ownership and evacuation. We do our hazard and risk vulnerability assessments and work with our emergency plans. And we understand the tactics for a specific hazard in an area and the systems and technology that we would use to notify individuals in a pre-warning stage, in a warning stage, or in an evacuation stage. All of these things are critical in terms of moving people from one area to a place of safety. Now let's talk a little bit about what do we do when we move 300, 500, 2,000 people from point A to point B. Well, guess what? We have to take care of them. And that's different even now than it was even 3 years ago or pre-COVID. We are now more focused on the psychosocial and mental health supports, culturally appropriate care, and making sure that we are taking care of the whole person and their whole wellness. Family reunification is important from the aspects of making sure that we are keeping the nucleus of groups together. If you are not actually thinking about the pets, the families, the elders, the food, the spiritual aspects, and how you are going to keep people together, you are setting yourself up for additional anxiety and stresses and problems. The more you can do early on when you're taking care of people to make them feel welcome and at home, the better you're going to be in being able to maintain the evacuation of those individuals in a system and process that may take now more than 72 hours, to the point where we talked about earlier, where it may take, we have to look at having someone housed for up to 2 months. So if you're looking at hotels, that means constant information, communicating with your people who are vulnerable, checking in on them, reestablishing their health care from plan A to plan B. You've moved them 300 kilometers. They don't have access anymore to their primary health care provider. All of these things you really have to think about from the basics and foundational concepts of taking care of people at the lowest common denominator and supporting them. I know that if you're on this call, you probably know a little bit about Maslow's hierarchy. You need to look at it from that perspective of taking people and at their basic needs. It is no longer just acceptable to provide clothing, food, and shelter and to not take care of the psychosocial well-being and the self-esteem and emotional aspects of the individual who's evacuated. We must do better. And I'm glad to say that what I'm seeing across Canada is we are getting better and taking care of all aspects of the evacuee. It's not perfect, and there's challenges across this country, but we are seeing a much better approach to taking care of the whole person and their family and keeping that unit together so that we can look at that. In Manitoba, in our wildfire season, we saw just an amazing complex of family unification coming together where we saw groups, we saw small teams, we saw cohorts of some small families coming together to form some sort of connection to normalize the process of them being together. An example would be we wanted to do certain activities with our people and evacuated in one of our large soccer complexes. And they came to us and say, well, on Wednesdays, this is the activity that we do at our home. So please change that from a Friday back to a Wednesday. These are simple little things that we can do to support people to make and normalize the evacuation process in a time where their emotional well-being needs to be taken care of because their home may have been destroyed or we're unable to provide them information as to when they can go back. So it's so important that we understand what that looks like. So now that we have the understanding of the foundations all the way from your planning to taking care of the people, now we have to understand what the plan is in repatriation and how do we get the people back. And far too often, we say that the recovery aspects in disaster and emergency management, in terms of the four pillars of disaster and emergency management, quite often is the ugly stepchild of disaster and emergency management. We're getting better, but repatriation, doing that slowly, providing those trauma-informed care supports so that people can truly move back and restart their lives. You have to understand that they may have lost their job. It's not just about, okay, the road's open, go home, clean out your fridge, and put in a claim to the government for the loss of all the meat in your fridge that's been ruined. It's more than that. It's about resetting the community and building that bond again and making sure if you've done a good job of communicating facilitating that trust relationship with the emergency responders and the individuals that are going to provide those supports as they move back in. You have to remember, if you're a member of the police service, fire service, sheriff, community, you're responsible for taking care of that community when the 5,000 people are out. They expect when they get back that everything is going to be restarted as fast as possible. And that may not be the case. There may only be one gas station that reopened in a town that has 8 gas stations. That's not normal. There may only be one grocery store that's open, and you're bringing people back and you're saying to them, everything is all good. It's not all good yet. A child may have lost their whole hockey season. We have to think about when we repatriate that we do it again from that foundational concept of taking care of the whole of the family. What was there before? What needs to be built back? And we're not talking about mitigation in terms of fixing whatever the hazard was that removed them in the first place. This is just about the human capital and taking care of the people that were evacuated. The recovery aspect in terms of mitigation and building back stronger so that it doesn't happen again is a whole other element of disaster and emergency management that we're not talking about today. So that repatriation of residents in recovery operations is critical. I can tell you that when we look at case studies of evacuations, we're starting to use the technology like GIS mapping, and we're starting to use better systems and processes to be able to even turn red lights into green when we're evacuating, using both sides of a road. When we're talking about bringing people back, we're starting to see more and more often municipalities having a slow approach. And it's almost as if like we're using cognitive behavior therapy to lower the stress levels and decrease anxiety by allowing people to first hear and then see what their community may look like now. If you look at what happened to Jasper and you saw how they repatriated individuals, they've started a process of letting people first hear, then see, then tour, then come back, have conversations, work through those anxieties and stresses. Again, so much of this is not perfect yet, and the Canadian emergency management world is growing and getting better, unfortunately, because the impacts and hazards keep increasing. But we have to continue to learn and grow, especially now in Manitoba, as we go on a path of reconciliation. Our relationships and recovery with our Indigenous leaders and partners has become so much more important. Our relationship in the Manitoba wildfire evacuation, this was one of the first times where we had core Indigenous leadership in our command presence to be able to support so that we could culturally understand how to best evacuate, to take care of, and to repatriate individuals in a way that was meaningful from the heart and did it justice from a perspective of taking care of the whole as a family. I believe that where we're going in Manitoba and across Canada is that working with Indigenous partners is going to be a strong way forward in our recovery efforts and our evacuation efforts, especially since we're seeing wildfires and major evacuations that are predominantly affecting Indigenous cultures in Canada. When we get north of the 52nd parallel in this country, the majority of the individuals that we're talking about in large populations, I mean, we have the outliers if anyone's from Edmonton, in Fort McMurray, there's the odd little place that's kind of up north where there's big populations. But the majority of the rest of Canada, most of Canada lives within an hour of the US border. So when we get up north, where we're seeing these horrendous floods and these wildfires, we know that we have to do a better job working with our Indigenous partners to make sure that we're doing this properly. And I was proud to see in Manitoba over our Manitoba wildfire season that we've started to implement those processes so that we can do it better, so that we actually can understand how to do this in a way that is respectful and more importantly, makes it smoother for everybody. So again, understand your powers, Where do you get your authority from? Understand that the evacuation is always going to be political because there's going to be costs. Understand the evacuation tactics based off of your hazards and your analysis of the risks that you're seeing. And then you can tactically make plans. And these aren't exactly plans where you, page one, do this, page two. We all know that no plan survives first contact with the disaster, right? We all understand that. But at least practicing, exercising, and having those conversations with your community stakeholders is critical. And that's a good segue into the last aspect that I want to talk about. One of the things that we can all do right now is we can go back to our communities and talk about who needs to be at the table, who needs to be here to have these pre-discussions about what this looks like at every level. Maybe it's your local RCMP. Maybe it's the Red Cross and some of your NGOs. And we always say that it's better to shake hands before a disaster than after. And the reality is, people are trying to do that, but are we doing it effectively and are we doing it enough? And I would challenge us to say we can do more on building the relationships pre-disaster so that when we have to act and work in unified command, that we actually have the people at the table from all aspects. Now, there is a construct here that we have to talk about. You've all heard too many chefs in the kitchen will ruin the soup. The reality is, if we're all pulling the rope the same way and we're all leading from a place of wellness, checking our egos and understanding emotional intelligence and knowing that we have a mission-driven solution, we should be able to bring the right stakeholders together. And that might be 6, it might be 12, or it might be 18. But we should be able to bring the right stakeholders together to have these discussions pre-disaster so that we are actually solving some of the problems beforehand. You might learn something from others that you don't have a lot of experience with. So if you're an NGO or a policy analyst that works business continuity, maybe you don't have a lot of field experience with police, fire, and EMS. Well, I happen to have a lot of knowledge and experience with police, fire, and EMS. But where my gaps are is maybe dealing with some of the cultural issues and learning about how we successfully take care of the whole person. Fire, police, and EMS were tactically driven. We all need to work together. So what I'm asking you to do as a take home from this talk is to have those conversations about who needs to be at the table. Can you have a meeting where you bring all your stakeholders together or a subset for just that specific hazard? What would we do if this part of our community flooded? Well, what's in that community? What are the hazards? What are the risks? Who's in that community? Is that community populated primarily by nursing homes and elderly? That might give you a hint about who needs to be at the table when you're talking about evacuations. Because we know dealing with the elderly or dealing with youth may be very different in terms of being able to evacuate people quickly. You may need more time. So, Mahmoud, where we're at right now is we could take some questions and open up to the dialogue. And I may not have all the answers, but I'm sure there's been questions put in the chat. I'd like to open this up a little bit. Maybe you and I can do some learning, do some listening, and let's see if we can share some examples of how we can collectively all get better at this specific element of emergency management.
For sure. Thank you so much, Jay. It's very interesting. I personally learned a lot. I see that we have some activities in the chat, and more specifically, we have a discussion about interjurisdictional evacuation. The question about what if the evacuation ended up in a different provinces or in different jurisdictional, the territories. We have some question in that regard, and maybe broadly, if you can explain a little bit what get involved if we have interjurisdictional evacuation, what's going to be the agreement or pre-planned or something like that, to be available before the evacuation. if you have a different experiences, for example, examples from the BC, from Calgary, I don't know, from Alberta, from Manitoba, that would be interesting to a little bit explain. And also, even if you have experiences, or if already existed, the evacuation from Canada to US or the inverse from the US to Canada, that would be also an interesting topic to discuss.
Yeah, and I'd like to tackle the question from Jodine Chase that says, what do we do when point B crosses provincial boundaries or territorial boundaries? That's a great question.
Mhm.
Even more reason for you to have pre-planning and discussions with all of your stakeholders. You want to talk about something interesting? When I went to fire school, there was a town not far away from us called Lloydminster, and it had the border of Alberta and Saskatchewan cut right through. I've always wondered how that town functions. I would assume that where there are jurisdictional differences and boundaries, that municipalities are already having meetings and stakeholders to understand what is going on and how they do that. In our profession, I have 7 municipalities that touch the borders of the city of Winnipeg. I know all of the people in each one of those municipalities. I have their phone numbers, I have their contact information, and I have access to be able to activate them quickly and effectively if I need to be able to get a hold of them, because we may have a plane crash that lands on the boundary of both municipalities. Or the evacuation requires me to move people from one spot, and it makes the most logistical sense to put those people in someone else's jurisdiction even though the disaster is not in their local jurisdiction. Well, you better have strong working relationships if you're going to call a city manager at 3 a.m. and say, hello, ma'am, may I move 452 people from my disaster into your community? And can we take over your community center? And that city manager is going to say, I don't know who you are. Not only that, but you're asking me to displace all of our community swimming and programming at our only community center for your 452 people that have been evacuated in your municipality. You have to be able to have those relationships established beforehand. So those boundaries are important. Obviously, we have to work in the confines of unified command if we're talking about an ICS structure in the first elements of a tactical, quick evacuation for life safety issues. But I would say it's super important to build those relationships before.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jay. We have also a few more questions in chat, but we have Wayan raise a hand. Yeah, please, maybe we can go with Wayan first, and then we will get back to the question in the chat. Yeah, please
Go
go.
ahead, Wayne.
Thank you. Great to see you. Winnipeg is my favorite Canadian city. Uh, I have a question about evacuations. You talked about the legislative underpinning and protections that decision makers have or should have before they make that call. And I'm wondering what experience you have or any advice you have on where to find that that permission. I know that Manitoba's, I was just looking at Manitoba's Emergency Management Act or whatever it's called, and it doesn't even mention the word evacuation. So is it just like this general ability for the minister or somebody to make a call on an evacuation that exists as long as it's written down somewhere, or where does that authority come from?
Yeah,
Thanks.
this is a great question. So in Manitoba, we have both a regulation and an act. And if you read those documents thoroughly, you will notice that we clearly delineate the powers that are given to the local authority. Those are, we can take over buildings, we can enter onto private property, we can evacuate livestock, we can move people, we can close roads, we can force people to work for us in a business as long as we compensate them, right? These are powers that you only get when there's a crisis or a disaster because you're infringing on people's rights. So in every province, there would be some form of regulation or act at the provincial level. And then depending on your relationship with your province, for example, in Ontario, there is a robust system where there's sort of one municipal act for sort of all municipalities with some annexes and appendages attached to it as they move through. In Manitoba, every municipality has their own rules and regulations that they follow. So a little different for us. In the city of Winnipeg, I have my emergency plan, but we also have bylaws in the city of Winnipeg that allow me and the people above me to delegate authority to myself in a disaster. So some of the tools and tricks that we do is we would give the authority to our city manager to delegate down to me that I may spend X amount of money in a disaster without having to go through an RFP process or having to be able to, get three quotes, because we set up these financial systems for transparency, so that in regular times, no one person has ultimate power, because ultimate power, could be a problem. However, the bureaucracy that requires the transparency and the accountability in normal times can be a real harm in a crisis. I'll give you a quick example. If tomorrow we had a disaster and I needed to authorize 5 crane companies to bring in cranes, and they told me that their cranes were going to cost $10,000, $20,000 a day because it was overtime costs. In normal times, I would never have the authority to snap my fingers and make that happen and pay these crane operators to be able to come in and move, debris from a flood or a tornado or something along that lines. That's that authority and that jurisdictional power that allows me to act quickly, effectively, but with some level of accountability so that we can determine what needs to be done immediately from those powers. If, for example, a disaster were to strike, Wayne, and I needed to enter onto your property under an emergency or a disaster, either declared or not, in the city of Winnipeg, once I determine through the authority given to me through delegation, I can use the powers under the bylaw. And if I had to, I might have to tear your house down to be able to build a dike to prevent the flood from ruining 400 other homes. That's a horrible decision that I would have to make to take your home away for you, but you would be compensated, you would be supported, and we would hopefully make you whole at the end of the day because we're trying to make the betterment of all individuals. So having that authority and that jurisdiction and those powers come from the act, but every emergency manager, and if you're in a private sector relationship or you're an NGO, you also need to know what your administrative powers are and what your authorities are in a disaster. What are you allowed to spend if there's a disaster? If you're in a private company and you have emergency managers or BCP professionals there, and you get taken over by cybersecurity, what's your spending authority to be able to pay ransom for an IT disaster? These are all things that we have to understand what our authorities are. It doesn't matter if you're a NGO, private commercial enterprise, or a government. You need to understand your authority in your jurisdiction.
Perfect.
Thank
you,
you.
Jay. Yeah, once again, I invite everybody to either, to entering your question directly in the chat box or raising your hand and asking your question by unmuting yourself. The next question that Jay we have in the chat box is about the case that, the people refuse to evacuate. The question is from Sean, and he mentioned that this was a major issue for them in BC during the 2023 Bush Creek East wildfire. And he is interested to hear your experiences from, the other jurisdictions to see how the other jurisdiction handle this type of the scenarios when people refuse to evacuate.
Yeah, so I've only had sort of 2 real experiences myself where I've rapidly evacuated individuals. So the one I talked about first was at an apartment building where the engineer said they wouldn't sleep in the building and it was going to fall down, and I had to get 300 people out like that. The other one was Right before COVID in 2019, over the Thanksgiving weekend, Winnipeg had a horrendous snowstorm, and all the leaves were still on the trees. And we put literally millions of pounds of wet snow on these trees in a windstorm, and then everything froze. And we literally created a disaster, a tree emergency. Calgary had one similar to this, where we had, I'm not lying, literally hundreds of down power lines throughout the city, hundreds of trees blocking roads so that fire, EMS, and police couldn't get through, and downed trees on houses, electrical cords on electrical power lines on houses. And in one area of our city, the hydro was damaged so badly that there was no way they were going to get power up in that area. And we had about 15,000 people that weren't going to have power for 6 or 7 days. And we had to make a decision. Are we going to try and support them, or are we going to evacuate them? And what we did is we did a door by door with teams of 100 people of vulnerability assessments, knocking on doors to see who was in these homes, who was left, because we asked people to self-evacuate to friends and family. But when we went in and did those vulnerability assessments, we found many people that were choosing to tough it out. Now, in Manitoba, if the temperatures go below zero, if it's below 0 and -10, you probably have about 2 or 3 days in your home before you start to see plumbing and freezing issues. We do know from evacuations and from hazards and research from Quebec, once you start getting into -10, -15, -20, in some situations, you may only have a day before you start seeing homes completely freeze up where it's not safe to be in there. What happens in a home when somebody all of a sudden wants to stay in that home when it's unsafe? They choose to start using hazards or behaviors that may threaten their own personal safety. Using a barbecue indoors to be able to heat their home, causes carbon monoxide poisonings. Trying to use a wood burning fireplace that may not be effective, carbon monoxide, but also burning your home down. So what do we do when we have individuals that don't want to move? Well, we know the public sentiment is if we give the order to evacuate and we come to your house and try and evacuate and you don't evacuate, we do know that in a jurisdictional scan, that most of those people, when the crisis comes, that we generally have to go back and rescue them. This puts responders in jeopardy, and it puts a really big strain on our emergency services system when we have to go back in and rescue people. And unfortunately, on occasion, we're actually rescuing people that have been deceased because they didn't heed the warnings. So we communicate the best we can. But in my understanding and what I've seen, I haven't seen in too many cases where we have handcuffed people and put hands on them to pull them out of a situation. Now, if there is an imminent threat to your personal safety, like for example, the wildfire is in your backyard and we're at your front door, there may be a situation where we're trying to grab and go because even the life of the officer, firefighter, sheriff, RCMP is at risk in that situation. So it's a very challenging situation. And I hope that none of you ever have to get put into that situation where you're choosing to stay and not only put your loved ones at risk, but also the responders that will have to come back and rescue you when the floodwaters come, the tsunami comes, the tornado comes, or the power outage gets to the point where it's inhabitable to stay in your house because it's so cold.
Thank you so much, Jay. I would also like to invite those who are interested in this topic to explore the experience of Quebec after 2017 and 2019 floods. For example, in some municipalities, something like Rigaud in southern Quebec, the municipality of the Rigaud ordered evacuation, forcibly evacuation after 2017 floods. But then after the flood, the community, the resisted, and they took the municipality to the court at the same time. And then in 2019, they changed the policies, and the evacuation became even the voluntarily not as as a the suggestions of the evacuation, not any order of evacuation being issued.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And the heat release studies on the homes in Quebec from their ice storm, 20 years ago or whenever it was, are still used today. They need to be updated, better
Mm.
insulation, better understanding of sort of how long you can stay in your home. These are great points and we always need to be studying the successes of other disasters.
Mm.
Jodine Chase put another question in the comment that I just want to address, Mahmoud. She says,
Sure.
we saw a lot of gaps in Yellowknife and massive disproportion of public health. They tracked folks in virtually every province and territory. One of the issues that we saw in our Manitoba wildfires, which I felt were absolutely horrendous, but not by anyone's doing, is that in some areas where we had roads where we could evacuate people, we were using school buses and things like that. But when you put 35 adults and their pets in a school bus and you try and drive 9 hours to Winnipeg or Brandon or wherever you're coming from, those individuals left with only the clothes on their backs. And when they show up at our reception centers, yes, from a Maslow's perspective, we want to offer them kindness, food, shelter, and security to feel like they're not going to be harmed. But the reality is they don't have any ID. They might not have their medications. And we have to create systems where we can remove the bureaucracy, where we have to be able to get right to the point and understand what they need. And those public health systems are getting a lot better in our province about immediately recognizing people where they're at. Did you come off the school bus? And this is something I saw with my own two eyes. You just came off the school bus with your wife and 3-year-old and a 110-pound Great Dane dog, and you haven't taken your seizure medication in now 12 hours, and you're starting to feel ill. Well, we better get you your seizure medication, and we better have a way to be able to take care of you right now. I think what I'm seeing across Manitoba and across Canada is we're getting better at the recognition of meeting people where they're at, because sometimes you have no notice to evacuate. Other times, you may be able to cobble together your 72-hour kit and bring a suitcase with your medications, your ID, and all those aspects. But really good point that Jodine makes up in terms of the public health and how they track folks. Another aspect is when people come in to locations where they've been evacuated from, if they don't have ID and they're vulnerable, a lot of times we lose them. And that is unfortunate and unacceptable. And on certain circumstances, when we try and repatriate people, we evacuated 1,800 people out of community, but we only put back 1,750. Well, where did the other 50 people go? We need to make sure that we have a good process of taking care of the whole of the community. It doesn't matter who you evacuate. You evacuate all of their vulnerabilities, all of their successes, and all of their culture. I like to say, if you evacuate Beverly Hills, you get Beverly Hills in your reception center. If you evacuate a population that doesn't speak your language, then you will face those challenges when you get them to your reception center. And you need to be akin to understanding what those vulnerabilities are and what the needs are of that population. So great point.
Perfect. Thank you. I see Jodins has another point, interesting point, and another interesting comment regarding the differences between cash, depositing money into the person's account, and comparing to the traditional reception center. Could you please
Yeah.
elaborate on that one as well?
Yeah, so this is a great question. Generally, we work with partners like the Canadian Red Cross or Mennonite Disaster Services and NGOs that may be able to provide cash cards or Visa cards to people on receipt of identification. But if you don't have identification and you just show up at one of our evacuation centers, that cash system may not work because it's unhard or it's very hard to track. However, I'll give you an example of something which was a nuance for us in the Manitoba disaster file for this wildfire season. We did do reimbursements through the Red Cross, where the federal government, the provincial government did pay people and give them some cash money in some circumstances. But for the first time ever, through our partnerships with Indigenous people and Indigenous leadership at the tactical level, they organized clothing drives and food drives. And what's one of the tenets of emergency management now? We don't do donation management. It's been taught to us for the last 10 to 15 years for sure, to the point where we say, no donations, no donations, because then we have to deal with it. Well, I'll tell you something. We have to reevaluate that because the donations that came in to support our Manitoba evacuees really helped them. And I will tell you that it was a success if it was managed properly. Now, I don't have the academic evidence to say, let's completely change over and go back and say we need to, take donations again. But in this situation, it needs to be reevaluated about how we take care of people. The stereotypes and stigma about giving people cash and then them, not spending it on things that are appropriate for their evacuation needs to end. The reality is that people need to be met where they're at, and we need to take care of people. And those types of things, are dog whistles for potential stereotypes or even racism behavior. We have to be very careful about making sure that we take care of people where they're at and that we look at the community as a whole. Like I said, if you're evacuating Beverly Hills, you're getting Beverly Hills. If you're evacuating a vulnerable community, meet them where they're at. Human dignity is incredibly important. And everyone, if we took away your credit cards, your money, we took away all your resources, how quickly would you become as vulnerable as some of these communities that we've seen in Manitoba, Ontario, Alberta, and BC northern wildfires? It would be a quick study to know how vulnerable that we would all feel. So I think it's important that we relook at this because donation management really actually worked for us. It was challenging, but in some cases, it built community, it supported culture, and it made people feel connected to their home. And that was important.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. In a few more minutes that we have, maybe we'll be able to answer some of the more questions. For example, Heather asked, do you play a role in reducing the needs for evacuations? For example, implementing fire resistance building materials, a sprinkle system, or etc.
Yeah, so great question, Heather. I will say that in the fire paramedic service, we have a whole community risk reduction strategy. And I would say that fire resistant materials, sprinklers, all of that is very much on. We have our first community that's about to be built in Winnipeg, where the bylaw now says for that specific community, because it's surrounded by some rail lines that may reduce the efficacy of our responses in police, fire, EMS, that every home in that community must be sprinklered. And we're talking about townhouses and multifamily aspects. Now, we had a lot of pushback from building owners and construction people on this, but we fought hard and we won that battle. What I will tell you is, Canada, such a beautiful country with vast open spaces, we really truly don't know what population density is. Maybe in some areas of Vancouver and Toronto, but population density in this country is nowhere near what it's like in other areas. As we grow, as we get bigger, as more people come, because we're all immigrants in this country, what we're going to need is those stronger fire prevention bylaws and systems to be able to protect. Now, fire guarding and working with our wildfire partners on prevention is also critically important. Now, urban interface wildfires, because of our topography in the city of Winnipeg, I had some family in from BC this summer, and they're like, "Oh, your trees are so small." It's like Manitoba doesn't have the topography to really worry about urban interface wildfires right in our city, in the city of Winnipeg. Of course, we do once we get into the central and northern Manitoba. But these are really good points. And I would put this on the mitigation and preparedness aspects and that pillar, obviously. But I'm a big fan of sprinklers myself, obviously as a firefighter and paramedic. So
Mm. Perfect. Thank you so much. I see Sasha asked a question. We have maybe as a last question. Sasha is also here. Sasha, would you mind to ask your question by yourself, or do you want me to read the question?
Yeah, thank you, Mahmoud. I can explain what I was going to say. Chief Shaw, I'm here on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis, just outside of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And I would
congratulations on your Grey Cup win.
thanks for hosting
Yeah.
and doing all the pre-planning that you had to do. So I had heard either through the Saskatchewan Ombudsman or through the media, I honestly can't cite where it was, that some of the Saskatchewan evacuees that evacuated east, and do believe they were from the Denair Beach area,
Yeah.
they evacuated to Manitoba and then were denied services. And I don't think it was Manitoba denying the services, but Saskatchewan was like wanted them to come back for compensation. Um, did you hear this? And I don't know if that's like beyond your scope. Maybe it
So a
isn't.
little bit beyond my scope, I am aware of the general framework of the jurisdictional scan about what happened. We have a town, Flin Flon, where half of the city is in Saskatchewan, and 70%, 65% of it is in Manitoba. We've got one little area where all the people in Saskatchewan have to get their license, and even though they're from Saskatchewan, their license plates are Manitoba, and in some cases vice versa, depending on where your street is. Anytime we have boundary issues, it's so important to get ahead of that when that comes. Um, when we tell people, first and foremost, evacuate to friends and family, there's a reason why we do that. And it's not just to save money and costs. It's better for Sasha to be with her aunt, her uncle, her stepdad, her husband's parents, wherever, because you're going to feel that better connection to home and you're going to be taken care of. Friends and family are always the best place to go in an evacuation. The problem with that is that we're giving you the free will and the choice of where that is. And that might be in Manitoba or it might be in Alberta. Governments seem to have a theory that your needs are going to be met if you self-evacuate and are taking care of yourself completely. And I've seen situations where there's been conflict regarding compensation, where people have been able to successfully evacuate to friends and family, but aren't eligible for the compensation as if they were put up in a hotel or in what we would call some sort of reception center or congregate shelter. I don't really have an opinion on that right now, but I do understand that it's a challenging situation. And the costing, you know, for a hotel room as opposed to putting someone in congregate shelter is significant, right? So I do know that there are challenges in there with the ability to be able to support people where they're at financially. Because let's be honest, if you went to your aunt's house, Sasha, she may be unemployed or retired, and you're not working now and not making money, and your aunt can't pay for all your food for you and your family, right? Can't put the gas in your car. I think there's an expectation that we forget all the time that the number one person that's responsible for themselves in an evacuation is Sasha. And the governments never want to come out and say that, but we know the literature is true. We are all number one responsible for ourselves in this country. And it's a challenging synopsis to talk about that in a disaster time to say, hey, this is on you. You're the one that's supposed to have a preparedness kit, a go-kart, or not a go-kart, a go bag, a 72-hour kit, and an emergency plan to evacuate. And it's on you to take care of it. And the government only steps in when you're unable. So it's a tricky transition to then say, Sasha has evacuated her friends and family, but we're going to give her money while she's there. I think that there's an opportunity to have those larger discussions about what it looks like, but ultimately, each municipality and each government has to be able to make those decisions. If Sasha chose to evacuate to Alberta because that's where her parents were, and that was going to be the best system for her, and the Saskatchewan government says, well, if you want $400 a day, you need to have actually evacuated into Saskatchewan. That's a policy decision that the Saskatchewan government has made. And I would say that as we look forward to, better understandings and meeting people where they're at in a disaster, maybe some of those policies can be evaluated.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you so much, Jay. Thanks everybody for your participation in this session. I'm a bit cautious about the time. It passed 1 p.m. here in Victoria. So maybe we have to end the session, but we have some questions remain unanswered in the chat. I would invite everybody, because based on the generosity that I know from Jay, I would invite everybody to directly contact Jay, keep this communication and that keeping this discussion going on. And also, I would invite everyone to please, if you miss a section after this presentation or the lecture, or would like to invite your friends, your colleague to listen to this lecture, please follow up us. And I will put the link to the recording to the website, and you will be able to share the recording with your colleagues and friends. Thanks again, Jay, and I would end up the session here. Thank you. Bye.
All right. Thanks, everyone. I'll stay on for a second with you, Mahmoud, but
Thanks so
sure.
much. That was great.